On the eve of his hanging, when the jailhouse had grown quiet enough to hear the slow breathing of the building itself, Elias Crow sat alone on the narrow cot and listened to the wind move through the gallows outside, a soft, hollow sound like the land remembering every man it had taken, and in that lonely hour, with the oil lamp burning low and the shadows stretched thin against the stone walls, he began to speak, not to the guards who had long stopped listening, nor to God, whom he was not sure had ever listened at all, but to the darkness itself, as if the night were an old friend who had followed him across deserts and rivers and blood-soaked trails, and his voice was low, steady, almost gentle, nothing like the snarling killer the townsfolk believed him to be, and he confessed that the name they cursed was not the name his mother whispered when she braided his hair by the riverbank, that before the legend there was a boy who learned the shape of stars and the sound of kindness in a world that rarely offered it, and he spoke of a promise made under a cottonwood tree, of a woman named Clara Bell who believed he could be more than what the world expected him to become, and as he spoke the wind seemed to lean closer, rattling the noose ropes outside as if urging him on, and Elias admitted that the first blood he ever spilled was not taken in anger or greed but in fear, when a lawman with tired eyes and shaking hands mistook a boy's reach for a knife as a threat, and the shot that followed changed the course of his life forever, because from that moment the world decided who he was, and he learned quickly that once a man is named a monster, the world gives him little choice but to live up to it, and yet even as he rode with men whose laughter was sharp and cruel, even as towns burned his name into wanted posters and mothers pulled their children inside at the sound of his boots, he carried a secret heavier than any steel bag, a truth buried so deep he had never dared speak it aloud, not even in his own thoughts, and that truth was that every raid, every stolen horse, every bank shattered by gunfire had been done not for gold but to draw the law farther and farther from a small valley hidden between red hills, a place untouched by maps, where Clara had gone to hide after the night he did not return, and he confessed that he became louder, crueler, more feared on purpose, shaping his legend like armor, so no one would ever look too closely at the quiet places he protected, and as the night grew colder and the lamp flickered, he spoke of riding alone through storms just to catch a glimpse of smoke rising from a distant chimney, of counting seasons by the color of her curtains from afar, never daring to approach because his presence would bring danger, and the outlaw laughed softly then, a sound edged with sorrow, admitting that the greatest crime he ever committed was staying away, because love, once chosen, demands courage greater than any gunfight, and he had lacked it, and the wind outside rose and fell as if breathing with him, carrying the creak of the gallows beams into the cell, and Elias said he accepted the rope because it would finally end the chase, finally stop the trail of blood that followed his shadow, and perhaps, just perhaps, free Clara from the last echo of his name, and yet there was more, always more, because the secret that could rewrite the Wild West was not just that he had loved or protected or sacrificed, but that the massacre pinned to his name, the one sung about in saloons and whispered by firesides, had never happened the way the stories told it, that on that night, years ago, when a whole town burned and dozens lay dead, he had arrived too late, finding the streets already soaked, the killers gone, and the law eager for a villain to hang their grief upon, and he had taken the blame without protest, because by then the legend served him, and because the Real killers wore badges and rode under flags of order, and his confession grew darker then, his voice barely more than breath as he admitted that he knew who truly ordered the slaughter, knew their names, their families, their places of honor, and chose silence because speaking would only trade one noose for many, and the night pressed in close, the cell seeming smaller as the truth filled it, and Elias Crow, the most hunted man in the territory, finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had carried, the loneliness of being known by everyone and understood by no one, and he said, quietly, that if the world had given him one more dawn, he would not have asked for freedom, only for the chance to walk once more to the edge of that valley and let Clara see him plainly, not as a ghost or a legend, but as a man who had loved her the only way he knew how, from a distance shaped by fear and hope in equal measure. And as the confession reached its end, the wind stilled for a moment, the gallows falling silent, as if even death itself paused to listen, and Elias lay back on the cot, eyes open, heart strangely calm, unaware that somewhere beyond the jail walls, his words, spoken only to the dark, were already beginning to move, like a spark carried by the night, toward ears that would not forget them, and toward a morning that might not end the story the way the Wild West believed it would. She arrived at Red Mesa the way dust storms do, without warning and impossible to ignore, riding a gray mule beneath a sky bleached pale by the sun, her black veil fluttering lightly though there was barely any wind. And from the moment her boots touched the hard-packed street, the town seemed to draw inward, doors closing, voices lowering, eyes following her with a mix of fear and sorrow, because everyone in Red Mesa knew the name Mara Quinn, even if few dared speak it aloud, and fewer still remembered when it had not been spoken like a curse, for the stories said she was a widow 3 times over, and every man who had ever loved her had died violently, shot down in gulches, dragged from saddles, or left bleeding beneath open skies, and whether she brought death with her or merely followed it was something no one could agree on, only that where Mara Quinn settled, graves soon followed, and so when she took the small adobe house at the edge of town, near the red rocks that bled color at sunset, the townsfolk told themselves she would not stay long, that sorrow never roots itself forever, but they underestimated the quiet strength in her step and the way she carried grief not like a wound, but like a memory that had learned to breathe, and days passed with her moving through town like a shadow softened by light, buying flour, trading cloth, never lingering, never inviting conversation, though the men watched her with a longing sharpened by fear, because beauty clung to her not in youth or brightness but in stillness, in the calm of someone who had already lost everything that could be taken, and beneath her veil her eyes were steady, dark, and tired, eyes that had once believed in promises whispered under stars and now trusted only the land beneath her feet, and if the town feared her name, it was because Red Mesa had seen enough blood to recognize patterns, and hers felt like one written by fate itself, and yet fate, as it always does, had other plans, because one evening, as the sun burned low and the rocks glowed like embers, Mara heard a sound outside her door that did not belong to the desert, a rough, broken breath dragged across dry earth, followed by the dull thud of a body giving in, and when she opened the door she found him collapsed against the step, a man barely conscious, his shirt dark with blood, his gun fallen from nerveless fingers, and though she had sworn long ago never again to pull an outlaw from death's edge, her body moved before her mind could stop it, dragging him inside with a strength born not of hope but of habit, because loss teaches you what to do in emergencies, and as she cleaned the wound by lamplight, cutting away cloth, pressing rags to torn flesh, she recognized the signs immediately, the way he carried himself even in pain, the scars layered over scars, the hands shaped by violence and survival, and she knew this man was trouble long before he whispered his name in fever, Jonah Hale, a gunslinger with a price on his head and blood on his trail, and at that name her heart tightened, because she had heard it before, spoken in the same breath as raids and gunfights and men who never made it home, and as Jonah drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring fragments of places and faces long gone, Mara felt the familiar dread settle in her chest, the cold certainty that fate had come knocking again, wearing a different face but carrying the same ending, and she considered letting him die, truly considered it, because mercy can be cruel when it leads only to graves, but as the night deepened and the desert cooled, Jonah's breathing steadied under her care, and something inside her broke open just enough to let compassion through, because she saw not a legend but a man running from something he could not outride, and when dawn came pale and uncertain, he was alive, and Red Mesa would never be the same again, because rumors move faster than blood in small towns, and soon everyone knew the widow had taken in a wounded gunslinger, and fear returned sharper than before, for this was how the stories always began, with kindness mistaken for fate, and Jonah healed slowly, days stretching into weeks, his strength returning in quiet increments, and during those days they spoke little of the past, but much of the present, of the way the sun struck the mesa at noon, of the sound the wind made at night, of things that mattered only because they were shared, and the attraction between them grew not in sparks but in embers, low and dangerous, held back by the knowledge of what it could cost, because Jonah knew the stories too, had heard them on the trail, and though he laughed them off at first, there were nights he lay awake listening to Mara move in the next room and wondered if loving her would mean signing his own death warrant, and Mara, for her part, felt the ache of longing like an old wound reopened, because Jonah looked at her not like a curse or a warning, but like a woman who still lived, and that gaze terrified her more than any gunman ever had, and as Jonah regained his strength, trouble followed close behind, shadows lingering at the edge of town, unfamiliar riders asking quiet questions, and Red Mesa grew tense, men keeping hands near holsters, women whispering prayers, and one evening, as the heat pressed heavy and the air felt wrong, Jonah told Mara he would leave before his enemies arrived, because he would not be another name carved into her legend, and she did not stop him, could not, because love born under threat learns to stay silent, but when gunfire erupted at the edge of town before dawn, echoing off the red rocks like thunder, Mara knew fate had already chosen, and she ran toward the sound despite every instinct screaming against it. Finding Jonah wounded again, not mortally this time, but enough to remind them both how close the edge lay, and as she helped him back to the house, her hands shaking with more than fear, Jonah finally spoke the truth he had been holding back, that he had never believed in curses, but he believed in patterns, and loving her felt like standing in the path of a storm he could not escape, and Mara, with tears tracing paths through dust on her cheeks, confessed that every man she had loved had died. Not because of her, but because she had chosen men already running from death, mistaking danger for destiny, and in that shared confession, something tragic and beautiful formed, a love aware of its ending even as it reached for the present, and they spent that night sitting side by side, not touching, listening to the desert breathe, knowing dawn would bring decisions neither of them wanted to make, and when morning came, bright and merciless, Jonah saddled his horse, healed enough to ride. And Mara stood in the doorway, veil lifted, her face bare to the sun, and they did not promise anything, because promises had a way of turning into ghosts, but as Jonah rode away, looking back only once, Red Mesa seemed to hold its breath, because everyone watching knew the truth they dared not say aloud, that some love stories are not meant to last, only to burn bright enough to be remembered, and somewhere deep in the desert, beneath the relentless western sun, fate smiled sadly, already deciding whether the widow of Red Mesa would claim another name, or finally be spared one. Deadwood Crossing had forgotten what law looked like, so when a lone rider appeared at the edge of town beneath a sky the color of old iron, most folks assumed he was just another ghost passing through, a broken-backed drifter with a limp in his left leg and a coat worn thin by years of dust and regret, but those who noticed the dull glint on his chest felt something stir that they had not felt in a long time, because the badge he wore, scratched, darkened, barely catching the light, was real, and the man wearing it was Thomas Rourke, a marshal who had sworn never to wear it again, a man who had buried his faith in justice along with the people he failed to save, and as his horse clopped slowly down the main street, past buildings leaning like tired old men and windows that watched him without blinking, the town seemed to test him, daring him to turn around, because Deadwood Crossing belonged to no one now but fear, run by a loose alliance of gangs who took turns bleeding it dry, and every attempt at order before had ended with a body swinging or burning, and Thomas felt the weight of all that history settle into his bones as he dismounted in front of the saloon, his leg flaring with pain, his hand steady only because he had learned long ago how to hide weakness, and the saloon went quiet when he pushed through the doors, the music dying mid-note, eyes lifting slowly, measuring him, because men who live outside the law can smell it on someone who once believed in it, and Thomas ordered water instead of whiskey, earning a few smirks, and stood there letting the silence stretch, because silence was a weapon too, and he needed the town to feel him before he spoke, and when he finally did, his voice was rough but calm, carrying the weight of someone who had shouted before and learned it did no good, and he said he was there to clean up Deadwood Crossing, not because he believed it could be saved, but because he owed a debt to the badge and to himself, and laughter answered him, sharp and cruel, because the last marshal who tried that had been buried behind the church with no name on the marker, and Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the memory of another town, another promise, another fire he had arrived too late to stop, because years ago, in a place called Willow Bend, he had worn that badge with pride, had believed that one good man could stand between the innocent and the wicked, and when a gang rode in demanding protection money, Thomas tried to negotiate, tried to be fair, and by the time he realized mercy meant nothing to men who thrived on fear, the town was already burning, his wife dead in the street, his young deputy bleeding out in his arms, and the badge had felt like a lie ever since, and Deadwood Crossing, with its broken boardwalks and haunted faces, felt too much like Willow Bend for comfort, and yet here he was, because running had not saved him, and neither had hiding, and as the day wore on, word spread fast, reaching the ears of men who did not like surprises, and by sunset Thomas had been warned twice to leave, once politely and once with a bullet fired into the dirt near his boots, and he ignored both, because fear loses its edge when you have nothing left to lose, and he spent the night in the old jailhouse, alone with the creak of beams and the echo of memories, polishing his badge not to make it shine, but to remind himself it still existed, and when morning came it brought trouble with it, riders flooding into town from 3 directions, banners and colors clashing, all of them drawn by the same rumor, that a marshal had come to Deadwood Crossing, and Thomas stood in the street as they gathered, townsfolk peering from behind doors, hope and terror fighting in their eyes, and the gang leaders demanded he leave or die, offering him a head start if he dropped the badge, and Thomas listened, really listened, because once he might have argued, but now he understood that law is not about words, it is about staying when leaving would be easier, and he told them he was not there to win, only to hold the line. long enough for the town to remember it deserved better, and the first shock came quick after that, and the street erupted into chaos, gunfire cracking like dry wood, glass shattering, men screaming, and Thomas moved through it with grim purpose, his limp slowing him but not stopping him, his shots measured, each one chosen, because he had learned the cost of recklessness, and though he took wounds, one across the shoulder, another grazing his ribs, he kept standing, kept drawing fire toward himself, giving the townsfolk time to run, to hide, to survive, and as the fight dragged on, something changed, because courage is contagious, and a shopkeeper fired back from a window, a stable boy dragged a wounded woman to safety, and Deadwood Crossing, long cowed, began to push back, and when the dust finally settled, the gangs were gone, some dead, some fleeing, leaving behind silence broken only by labored breathing and the crackle of distant fire, and Thomas stood alone in the street. Blood soaking his coat, his badge heavy on his chest, and he thought of Willow Bend, of the faces he could never forget, and for the first time he did not feel like he had failed them completely, because this time he had stayed, and as the townsfolk gathered around him, unsure what to say, Thomas knew the war was not truly over, that men would come again, that law is never finished, only fought for day by day, but as someone pressed water into his hands and another offered to tend his wounds, he felt something like purpose settle into place, not bright or hopeful, but solid and earned, and Deadwood Crossing, battered and blooded, had seen law return, not as an ideal, but as a man willing to stand between the town and the dark, even if it cost him everything, and as night fell, Thomas Rourke sat on the jailhouse steps, staring at the stars, knowing the ghosts of his past would never leave him, but for the first time in years, they no longer owned him, because the badge he never wanted to wear again had found its place, not as a symbol of what he had lost, but of what he was still willing to fight for. Black Canyon was a place the sun seemed to avoid lingering over, a deep scar cut into the earth where shadows gathered even at noon, and everyone who lived within 100 miles knew its name and the warning that followed it, because gold had been found there once, rich, shining veins hidden in the rock, and every man who tried to claim it had vanished or returned broken, muttering about voices in the dark. And so when Samuel Pike, a prospector worn thin by hunger and years of failure, discovered an old, brittle map tucked inside a dead man's coat at a desert way station, he should have burned it, should have listened to the way his hands shook as soon as he recognized the crude markings and the words Black Canyon scrawled like a curse, but desperation has a way of drowning out wisdom, and Samuel had nothing left to lose except a life already half spent, so he followed the map into the desert, riding alone beneath skies that grew heavier the farther west he traveled, and at first the journey felt ordinary enough, the land harsh but familiar, the silence broken only by wind and the creak of his saddle. Yet on the third night, as he camped beneath a shelf of stone, he heard something that did not belong to the desert, a whisper that seemed to rise directly from the sand, calling his name softly, kindly, as if spoken by someone who knew him well, and when he bolted upright, heart pounding, the sound faded, leaving only the wind, and Samuel told himself it was thirst, exhaustion, the tricks of a tired mind, but the whispers returned the next night, and the next, growing clearer, promising him warmth, wealth, an end to the long years of wandering and want, and with each mile closer to Black Canyon, the voice grew more demanding, less patient, reminding him of every failure, every door closed in his face, every time he had been told he was not enough, and by the time the canyon walls rose before him, black stone swallowing the light, Samuel was no longer sure whether he was following the map or being led, and the air inside the canyon felt wrong, thick and cold, carrying a faint metallic scent like old blood, and even his mule balked, eyes rolling white, refusing to go farther, forcing Samuel to continue on foot, each step echoing too loudly, as if the canyon were listening, and when he finally found the place marked on the map, a narrow crevice where gold glimmered faintly in the rock like trapped sunlight, his breath caught, and greed tangling tight in his chest, because the stories were true, the gold was real, and as he chipped away at the stone, filling his pouch with shining fragments, the whispers swelled into a chorus, no longer hiding their nature, no longer pretending kindness, telling him the price was due, reminding him that nothing buried so deep comes free, and Samuel laughed then, a cracked, desperate sound, shouting that he would pay any price, because men who have lived with nothing learn to fear nothing. And the canyon answered him, the ground trembling, shadows shifting as if alive, and memories not his own flooded his mind, faces of men long dead, eyes hollow, hands clawing at stone, all of them hearing the same promises, making the same bargain, and Samuel realized too late that the devil's gold was not cursed because it killed men, but because it fed on them slowly, hollowing them out until they belonged to the canyon more than the world above. And the whispers demanded he stay, demanded he dig deeper, demanded he give himself fully to the work, and days passed without him knowing how many, his body growing thin, his thoughts narrowing to the rhythm of pick against stone, the glitter of gold blinding him to everything else, until one night, in a moment of rare clarity, he remembered who he had been before the hunger, before the failures, before the voice told him he was worthless without riches, and that memory hurt worse than any wound, and he tried to leave, stuffing his pouch and stumbling back toward the mouth of the canyon, but the shadows closed in, the ground shifting, paths twisting where none had been before, and the whispers turned cruel, mocking his weakness, promising to take back everything he had stolen and more, and Samuel fell, scraping his hands bloody, gold spilling from his pouch and vanishing into the cracks of the earth as if reclaimed, and as he lay there, exhausted and terrified, he understood the final truth of Black Canyon, that it did not need to chase its victims, only wait, because greed always brings men back to the same dark places, and with a strength born of fear and regret, Samuel crawled onward, dragging himself toward the faint line of light that marked the canyon's edge, the whispers screaming now, furious, offering him one last bargain if he would only turn back, and he almost did, almost surrendered to the promise of an easy end, but at the final moment, he let go of the gold, let go of the voice, and crawled into the open desert as dawn broke weak and pale. And when travelers found him days later, delirious and empty-handed, he spoke of Black Canyon with terror in his eyes, warning them away, and though most dismissed him as mad, none could explain why his shadow never quite matched his movements again, or why, on quiet nights, those camped near the canyon still hear whispers carried on the wind, promising wealth to anyone willing to pay the terrible price, because the devil's gold remains where it has always been, buried deep in Black Canyon, waiting patiently for the next desperate soul to listen.